The project that's occupying most of my time at the moment, and a very important one for the National Transport Commission, is looking at a review of heavy vehicle roadworthiness that's been undertaken jointly with the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator. This project really was given its impetus after the Coots fuel tanker crash in Mona Vale in New South Wales almost a year ago. And at that stage, ministers asked the National Transport Commission to bring forward some work that was on our work program for next year on looking at what the inspection regimes around Australia are for roadworthiness of heavy vehicles, and at the same time asked the National Heavy Vehicle Regulator to accelerate the work that they had planned to do on reviewing the National Heavy Vehicle Accreditation Scheme, particularly in relation to the maintenance management aspect of it. I'm not going to talk very much about the review of accreditation this afternoon because that's very much a scheme that's of most interest to road freight vehicles rather than to buses, and every state and territory have their own accreditation or equivalent to accreditation requirements that buses need to comply with. But the overall outcome that we're looking for with this project is to take the range of different practices that are in place around Australia in terms of the requirements for vehicles to be maintained in a roadworthy condition, in terms of the inspection and testing regimes that are in place in the various jurisdictions, and the different compliance regimes, including roadside enforcement, that are undertaken to detect and deter defective vehicles, and develop a nationally applicable scheme that is going to raise the level of roadworthiness across the heavy vehicle fleet as a whole. So there are a few elements that we started as needing to deal with that. One's nationally consistent standards and approaches. We discovered very early on that every state does everything differently in this space for heavy vehicles. Now, that's not a great surprise. On most subject areas, when we come to look at what the states and territories are doing, we find that everyone does everything differently. The complication in this case was they did it differently, but they called it all by the same name. And so getting some sort of reasonable basis for comparison of the number of defects found in vehicles where the roadside inspection is done with a roller shaker trailer and some fairly sophisticated electronics, versus the level of defects when the roadside inspection is done by two men with a torch and a tape measure, that they're not detecting the same sorts of things and they aren't really comparable. We're looking at the most effective use of accreditation schemes and of the elements of accreditation schemes, really starting from the question of, if your accreditation scheme has requirements there that say this is what we require you to do to keep your vehicle in good roadworthy condition, why aren't we asking everybody to do that? And if it's not the right thing, how do we change it so that it is? Looking at the legislative provisions, the procedures, the operational provisions, and making sure that they're properly designed, they're consistent, and the interpretations of the standards are the same, whether it's being done by a senior constable outside Burke or by a roadside specialist road agency vehicle inspector at a checking station in New South Wales, that there's a consistent approach. And critically for us, that this didn't result in an enormous jump in costs either to the industry or to the governments. One thing we recognised from the outset was that there are operators out there in all sectors of the heavy vehicle industry, from the hire and reward to dedicated fleets, tankers, buses, freight vehicles, who are able to maintain their vehicles in a roadworthy condition, aren't being detected with defects at the roadside, and are still able to stay in business and be profitable. And we didn't want to be making any recommendations that required them to do any more than they were doing now. What we did want to make sure was that those operators who weren't maintaining their vehicle in good condition were brought up to that standard of the best in the industry, rather than just thinking that theirs was the only way to go. So we've put out two reports so far on the project. The phase one was really just a snapshot of what's actually going on around Australia at the moment. together with a survey of how the issue is managed in New Zealand, the US, Europe and the UK. Compare the different approaches, but really a factual document to lay out how things currently were. The Phase 2 report was a much more critical survey, and that identified 38 areas where there were opportunities to improve the way things were currently done. And that ranged from training for mechanics and enforcement officers through to providing an actual definition of roadworthiness in the heavy vehicle law, which doesn't currently exist. You'll see there that it was open for public submissions until last Friday. The next step that we're taking with this report is on the feedback we've had so far, which has included feedback from the bus industry, some aspects of the bus industry and bus manufacturers, is to develop a regulatory impact statement which will go out for public consultation between the middle of January and the middle of March next year. So there will be an opportunity then to provide comments on some very specific recommendations rather than the much broader suite of areas that we think there's possibility for improvement. Just to illustrate the thinking we've had around the roadworthiness regime we've got at the moment, this might be a little difficult to read from the back of the hall. You can just see if my little laser light is going to point. It's not, so watch the air hostess hand signals. Essentially, in order to get from a heavy vehicle to a defective vehicle, every operator of a vehicle, whether it's a truck, whether it's a bus, has various steps they can take as defences against their vehicle becoming unroadworthy. There's the procuring a good vehicle in the first place, procuring the right replacement parts of sufficient quality, the services of a mechanic who actually knows what they're doing to maintain the vehicle. There's the daily checks that you might ask your drivers to do, or a safety manager or a yard manager on the vehicles before they go out. It has been put to us by some bus industry people that they have the advantage that there's 20 or 30 people sitting behind the driver who are all too happy to point out if something's making a loud noise or smoke's emerging from where it shouldn't to provide early warning of a problem. The maintenance process that you've got in place, and for the most effective operators in this space, some form of checking to make sure that you're not just doing a maintenance process, but it's actually delivering the outcome of the vehicles being kept in roadworthy condition. On the other side, the right-hand side of the diagram, those green bars are the things that are being done largely by or on behalf of governments to detect a defective vehicle if it's found its way onto the road. If all of those things on the left have failed and the vehicle with a defect has got out there, or if a vehicle's developed a defect while it's actually out in service. So that's the periodic inspections, the annual or 6-monthly inspections that are required under state legislation. The enforcement activities, random inspections, targeted inspections where there's concern with an industry or a company of historic record. And should we go down the path, chain of responsibility investigations. And then the grey bar down the bottom is the accreditation schemes, which are essentially there for a number of reasons. Firstly, in the NHVAS space for trucks, if you're in that accreditation scheme, you get a free pass from the annual inspection requirement, which is perhaps giving up too much for too little, as things currently are. Then there's also the reassurance to customers that an accredited vehicle is more likely to be in a roadworthy condition. They can be confident in choosing to use the supplier of that vehicle that they're going to be roadworthy. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, for an operator who is doing their best to maintain their vehicle in a good roadworthy working condition, the auditing process for an accreditation scheme should be providing them with information as to whether or not that's working and if there are any improvements that need to be made to maintain the vehicles in good condition. So that's, as I say, basically the way we've been thinking. The sort of opportunities we've identified that aren't currently there at the moment are the need for a clear statement of what roadworthiness actually is in the National Heavy Vehicle Law. At the moment, it's a little vague in that you must maintain your vehicle to meet all vehicle standards at all times. nothing proactive about that. It's just an offence you can be charged with if the vehicle has been found to be defective when it's out on the road. So providing a positive requirement there would certainly clarify what we're looking for and remove some of the elements of interpretation about which of those vehicle standards actually are relevant to roadworthy condition. Better information, education and training has come to us from, as it often does, from all sectors that we've spoken to. The point was made to us by the head of a maintenance workshop for a heavy freight vehicle operator, that his mechanics were expert at fixing faults if they'd been identified. They weren't expert at looking at a vehicle and saying what might be wrong with it. That was a different skill set. And it's one that the vehicle inspectors from the states absolutely agreed with. So we're looking at how you get that information of what you need to look at, what the early warning signs are to detect some of those defects that are going to be problems. And a common understanding across the states and territories and across those responsible for maintaining and enforcing the standards of vehicles. Chain of responsibility in maintenance is something that's been of interest for some time. The challenge with that is finding what the actual responsibilities are to put on each party. There is no doubt that just giving a defect notice to a driver isn't an effective way of dealing with the maintenance standards of a vehicle in a vehicle fleet, nor is just doing it to the company that's operating the vehicle. So we are looking at ways to extend that to cover those whose decisions have an influence on whether the vehicle takes the road in an unroadworthy or properly maintained state, including within a company that where a decision to, say, reduce the maintenance budget has led to a drop-off in the roadworthiness of the vehicles under consideration. Standardised inspection systems. I said at the start that there is a difference between what you can get with some very high technology roller shaker brake testers on the side of the road and a torch and a tape measure. Both those sort of roadside inspections are still going to be going on, but some standardisation of what you can and can't detect with each one, and a differentiation between the expectations of how they're applied. So that we're not comparing apples with grapefruit when looking at different states or even different parts of the same state report a certain level of defects. Improvements to accreditation or safety management systems, and I think perhaps safety management systems there rather than accreditation is the relevant one. Accreditation affects a very large proportion of the bus operators around Australia, but quite a small proportion of the freight transporters, but finding the way to get a broader uptake of those safety management system requirements so it leads to a greater overall inspection, overall standard of roadworthiness, including beefing up the audit requirements so they'd include an actual inspection of some vehicles to verify the reality of what the paperwork is telling the auditor is something which is definitely on the cards. And finally, establishing a nationally consistent network and strategy for monitoring the fleet and for deploying the resources to inspect and detect vehicles that are most likely at the greatest risk of having defects, the greatest risk of having catastrophes if a defect's present in a vehicle. Where we're at the moment, I said we've got some recommendations that we'll be putting up to ministers in November, including the options that we propose to go out for public consultation in January, and there'll be opportunity for some consultation for the 2 months between mid-January to mid-March on those options. Just finally, I mentioned one other project that was at this time last year at the Adelaide conference was just about to get off the ground. Put out a discussion paper in February of 2014 about increasing the limit for two-axle buses from 16 to 18 tonnes. Feedback from that was essentially no major objections from any of these states or territories, although there was some degree of variance on what sort of conditions should be in place to allow that to happen. We've been working with the Heavy Vehicle Regulator and with Michael and the Bus Industry Confederation about what set of conditions would most suitably be able to be applied consistently around Australia. and have decided at this stage the best way to advance this is through notices issued by the heavy vehicle regulator as each state falls into line. Then once we've got the agreement on the exact conditions, we can follow that up with regulation. But that allows things to happen and progress before we've got unanimous agreement, which is always takes longer to obtain than one would expect. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, and over to Michael.